Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this journey. If you're drawn to stories of rediscovered love and second chances that come when you least expect them, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps support more stories of connection and renewal. Now let's discover how one social media message led to an extraordinary twist of fate that no one could have predicted. The Facebook notification popped up while I was stirring my morning coffee, the blue light illuminating my kitchen counter in the pre-dawn quiet. Margaret Collins wants to connect with you. I nearly scrolled past it. Another random connection request from someone selling essential oils or promoting a Beachbody program. But something made me pause, the spoon suspended mid-stir as recognition stirred in some forgotten corner of my mind. Margaret Collins, not Margaret Wilson, her married name that I'd overheard mentioned at our 25th high school reunion, the last time anyone had news of her. Margaret Collins, the girl with chestnut hair who sat beside me in advanced chemistry, whose laugh could make an entire classroom turn, whose goodbye in the summer of 1973 had left me hollow for years afterward. My finger hovered over the screen, suddenly unsure. 50 years is a lifetime. Marriages, children, careers, joys and sorrows accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer until the bedrock of youth is buried so deep you forget it's there. What could she possibly want after all this time? What would we even say to each other? Two strangers connected only by memories half a century old. Just accept it, Thomas, I muttered to myself. The habit of speaking aloud, one of many I'd developed during the 3 years since Eleanor's passing. It's just Facebook, not a marriage proposal. The joke landed hollow in my empty kitchen. I tapped accept before I could overthink it further, then set my phone face down on the counter. Whatever Margaret Collins wanted after 50 years could wait until I'd finished my coffee. The message came 3 hours later as I pruned the rose bushes Eleanor had planted along our back fence. Our fence, still our in my mind, though she'd never see another summer bloom. My phone chimed from my pocket, and I peeled off my gardening gloves to check it. Tom, it really is you. I wasn't sure. Your profile picture is so small, and people change. Do you remember me from Westlake High? I've thought about you over the years and wondered where life took you. Would love to catch up if you're open to it. Direct, warm, a bit hesitant. So like the Maggie I remembered, never one for games or pretense. I found myself smiling at the screen, feeling an unexpected lightness in my chest as I sat down on the garden bench. Margaret Collins. Of course I remember you. AP Chemistry, debate team, and the best dance partner at Winter Formal 72. Life has taken me in circles, but I've ended up just 30 miles from Westlake, retired now. Would be nice to catch up indeed. Her response came immediately. She must have been waiting, phone in hand, 30 miles. Tom, I just moved back to Clarion last month. That's only a short drive from you. My husband Richard passed 2 years ago, and I couldn't bear the emptiness of our house in Arizona anymore. My daughter convinced me to come back home. Would you like to meet for coffee? There's a little place downtown called Rosie's that makes a decent cappuccino. My heart performed a strange little stutter that I attributed to too much morning coffee. Meet Maggie Collins in person? The girl who'd once known all my dreams and fears, who'd written me daily during that summer she spent with her grandparents in Vermont, whose farewell kiss tasted of strawberry lip gloss and salt tears. The girl who'd chosen UC Berkeley and a future that couldn't include me while I stayed behind for the state college scholarship that would keep me close to my ailing mother. Coffee sounds perfect. Tomorrow at 10? The next 24 hours passed in a haze of unexpected nervousness. I changed my shirt 3 times before settling on a simple blue button-down that Eleanor had always said brought out my eyes. I trimmed my beard, debated removing it entirely, then laughed at my own vanity. At 73, I was long past the age of reinvention. It's just coffee with an old friend, I told my reflection sternly. But the man in the mirror, with his silver hair and lined face, seemed unconvinced. Rosie's cafe occupied a corner of Clarion's revitalized downtown, its large windows spilling golden light onto the sidewalk. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a table near the back where I could watch the door. My hands felt ridiculously unsteady as I arranged and rearranged the sugar packets in their ceramic holder. And then she was there, framed in the doorway, her eyes scanning the morning crowd. I would have known her anywhere. The chestnut hair had silvered elegantly, styled in a modern bob that framed her face. Lines fanned from the corners of her eyes and bracketed her mouth, evidence of both laughter and sorrow. But her posture remained straight, almost regal, and when she spotted me, her smile bloomed with the same radiance that had once made my teenage heart race in double time. "Tom," she said simply, reaching my table and standing there a moment, uncertain. "It's really you." I stood awkwardly, half extending my hand before she dismissed the formality with a small laugh and embraced me. She smelled of subtle perfume and something uniquely her, a scent that triggered memories like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. "Maggie," I said, my voice embarrassingly thick. "You look wonderful." "Liar?" she replied with that familiar directness. "I look 70, which is precisely what I am, but thank you for the chivalry." She settled into the chair across from me, her eyes, still that remarkable shade between green and amber, studying my face with curious intensity. "You've held up rather well yourself." "Clean living," I joked, neglecting to mention the triple bypass 3 years earlier that had preceded Eleanor's cancer diagnosis by mere weeks. "Though this beard hides a multitude of sins. I like it. Very distinguished professor." She smiled, and for a moment I glimpsed the 17-year-old girl who'd once written poetry in the margins of her chemistry notes. We ordered, cappuccino for her, black coffee for me, and fell into the strange dance of strangers who were once intimates trying to bridge a 50-year gap. "You stayed local then?" she asked, stirring a packet of raw sugar into her coffee. "After college?" "Never left," I admitted. "Got my teaching degree and spent 40 years shaping young minds. Or trying. 2. At Ridgeview High. Married Eleanor Barnes. You remember her? Year behind us, played clarinet in the band." Something flickered across Margaret's face. Recognition, perhaps, or something else I couldn't quite identify. "Eleanor." "Yes, sweet girl. I remember her watching you during debate tournaments." She paused. "You said spent 40 years teaching. Retired now?" 5 years ago. Eleanor insisted, said we should travel while we still had good knees. My smile felt brittle suddenly. "We made it to England and part of France before she was diagnosed. Pancreatic. It was quick, at least." Margaret reached across the table, her fingers light on my wrist. "I'm so sorry, Tom. Truly." "And Richard?" I asked, needing to redirect the conversation before the familiar grief could take hold. "Heart attack. Playing golf, his favorite place to be. Found him on the 16th green." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her cup. "Strange how life gives you decades with someone and then suddenly—" She snapped her fingers softly. "They're gone and you're left wondering who you are without them beside you." "Exactly that," I said, struck by her perfect articulation of the sensation that had haunted me since Eleanor's passing. "Did you have children?" Her face brightened. 2. Michelle lives here in Clarion. She's the reason I moved back. She's a pediatrician, married to a lovely woman named Stephanie. They have twins, 10 years old and too smart for anyone's good." She pulled out her phone, displaying a family photo of smiling women and children. "And my son David is in Seattle, environmental engineering. One granddaughter there, starting college this fall. You?" "One son, James, lives in Chicago with his wife. 3 teenagers who barely acknowledge my existence except when their phones need replacing." I smiled to soften the words. They're good kids, just at that age. We fell into easy conversation then, the initial awkwardness dissolving as we compared lives lived in parallel. Her career in library science, my years in the classroom, the places we'd traveled, the books that had moved us, the technologies, that still confounded us. 2 hours slipped by unnoticed, our coffee cups long empty. "I should let you go," Margaret said finally, glancing at her watch. "I promised Michelle I'd help with the twins this afternoon." "Of course," I said, fighting an irrational disappointment. "It was wonderful to see you, Maggie, truly." She studied me for a moment, her head tilted slightly in that considering way I suddenly remembered from debate team strategy sessions. "Would you like to have dinner sometime, Tom? There's a new place on Riverside that's supposed to have excellent salmon." The question hung between us, weighted with possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider in the years since becoming a widower. Dinner felt different from coffee, more deliberate, less easily dismissed as simple nostalgia. "I'd like that very much," I heard myself say. Her smile was luminous. "Friday? Around 7? Perfect." As I watched her leave, her silver bob catching the morning light, I felt something shift inside me. A door opening to a room I'd thought permanently sealed. I remained at the table long after she'd gone, turning my empty cup in circles, wondering what Eleanor would say about this unexpected reunion. "You'd tell me to go to dinner, wouldn't you?" I murmured. "You always said I needed more friends." But as I finally rose to leave, I wasn't certain friendship was what had sparked in that cafe, or what had been simmering beneath Margaret Collins' invitation. And most surprising of all was my reaction to that uncertainty. Not anxiety, not guilt, but a quiet, tentative anticipation I hadn't felt in decades. I walked to my car under a sky suddenly bluer than it had been that morning, wondering what one wears to dinner with a high school sweetheart after 50 years, and what exactly I was going to tell my son when he inevitably called for our Sunday check-in. Some stories, I was beginning to realize, don't end with goodbye. Sometimes they're just waiting for the next chapter to begin. Thank you for returning to this journey of rediscovery and second chances. In this continuation, we'll explore how one dinner date reopens doors long thought sealed, and how the echoes of the past begin to reshape the present in unexpected ways. Friday arrived with the kind of perfect early autumn weather that seems designed specifically for new beginnings. Crisp air, golden afternoon light, and leaves just beginning their transition to amber and crimson. I spent the morning puttering around my garden, deadheading the last of Eleanor's roses while trying to quiet the chorus of voices in my head. "It's just dinner," I told the particularly persistent red bloom that reminded me of Eleanor's favorite lipstick, 2 old friends catching up. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. The nervous energy humming through my veins hadn't been felt since I was a much younger man, and the number of times I'd checked my watch suggested something more significant than a casual meal between acquaintances. At 4 o'clock, I finally admitted defeat in my battle against anticipation and headed inside to shower and change. Standing before my closet, I confronted the wardrobe of a man who had stopped caring much about his appearance. Comfortable slacks in various shades of beige and khaki, button-downs in practical colors, sweaters Eleanor had chosen because they brought out my eyes. Nothing seemed right for tonight. After 20 minutes of indecision that would have amused my late wife to no end, I settled on charcoal slacks and a deep blue shirt I'd purchased for James's wedding 3 years earlier, but rarely worn since. As I fastened my watch, the vintage Omega Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary, my phone rang with the specialized tone I'd assigned to my son. "Perfect timing," I muttered, bracing myself as I answered. "James, how are the kids?" "Hey, Dad, they're fine. Zach made varsity soccer, Emma's still ruling debate club, and Lily's decided she wants to be a marine biologist this week instead of a YouTube star, so that's progress." My son's voice held the cheerful exhaustion of middle age that I remembered well from my own years of teenage parenting. How about you? Staying busy? The casual question created an unexpected dilemma. Should I mention Margaret? The dinner? It suddenly seemed both too significant and too tenuous to share. Oh, you know how it is, I hedged. Garden keeps me occupied. Book club meets next week. Actually, I heard myself adding, I'm heading out to dinner tonight. Yeah? With the Hendersons? James asked, referring to the couple Eleanor and I had often dined with. Our friendship carried forward by habit and shared grief after both Carol Henderson and Eleanor had passed within months of each other. No, actually. An old friend from high school moved back to town. We're catching up. High school? Wow, that's going way back. Anyone I'd know from your stories? I hesitated just a moment too long. Dad? Who is it? Margaret Collins, I admitted, feeling ridiculously like a teenager caught passing notes in class. We dated senior year. The silence on the other end stretched for 3 heartbeats. Margaret Collins, James repeated slowly. As in, the one who got away? Margaret, the one Mom used to tease you about whenever you got nostalgic at reunions? That Margaret Collins? I winced. Eleanor had indeed found my occasional wistful mentions of first love amusing rather than threatening, secure in the decades of our marriage. She wasn't the one who got away, James. She was my first serious girlfriend who happened to choose a different college across the country. That's all. Uh-huh. James's tone was skeptical but not unkind. And now you're having dinner with her. Interesting. It's not interesting. It's just dinner, I protested, echoing my earlier conversation with the Roses. Her husband passed away a couple of years ago. She moved back to be near her daughter. We're 2 old friends catching up, nothing more. If you say so, Dad. The smile in his voice was audible. But hey, I think it's great you're getting out there. Mom would approve. Would she? I wondered after we'd said our goodbyes. Eleanor had been nothing if not practical, often telling me during her final months that she expected me to find someone nice after she was gone. I won't have you turning into one of those grumpy old men who forget how to talk to people, she'd said, her voice frail but her eyes fierce with conviction. Promise me you'll at least try to be happy. I'd promised, of course, but until Margaret's message appeared on my screen, I hadn't taken a single step toward fulfilling that vow. The Riverside Bistro occupied the ground floor of a renovated textile mill, its brick walls and exposed beams softened by warm lighting and carefully placed greenery. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, and claimed a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the eponymous river flowing languidly beyond the windows. The hostess, young enough to be my granddaughter, placed menus before me with a bright smile. Can I bring you something to drink while you wait for your date? She asked. Not a date, I corrected automatically. Just meeting a friend. But yes, perhaps a glass of the house Cabernet. She nodded, her expression suggesting she didn't believe my disclaimer for a moment. Was I that transparent? I wondered, straightening the silverware that needed no adjustment. Had I somehow arrived with nervous widower on first date emblazoned across my forehead? The wine arrived just as Margaret appeared in the doorway, and I was grateful for something to do with my hands as I watched her scan the room. She wore a simple dress in a shade of teal that complemented her complexion, her silver hair catching the golden light from the bistro's fixtures. When she spotted me, her smile ignited something long dormant in my chest. I stood as she approached, suddenly conscious of my posture in a way I hadn't been in years. Maggie, you look lovely. Thank you. She accepted the compliment without deflection. Another thing I remembered about her. Margaret Collins had never been one to diminish herself to make others comfortable. This place is charming. Good choice. I wish I could take credit, but it was your suggestion, I reminded her, holding out her chair. Was it? Memory is such a strange thing at our age. She settled across from me, her eyes crinkling with amusement. I ordered takeout from here last. Week with Michelle and thought the menu looked promising. The salmon is supposed to be excellent. Then salmon it shall be, I decided, closing my menu with relief. One less decision to navigate in an evening already fraught with uncharted territory. The waiter appeared, another impossibly young person who referred to us as you folks, and recommended a wine pairing with an enthusiasm that made Margaret bite her lip to suppress a smile. We ordered, and as he bounded away, she leaned forward. When exactly did we become folks, Tom? I don't recall receiving that memo. Somewhere around the time music became too loud, and comfortable shoes became more important than stylish ones, I suggested, and her laugh, that same infectious sound that had once turned heads in our high school cafeteria, washed over me like a warm wave. Speaking of music, she said, do you still play? I remember those calluses on your fingertips, how rough they felt when you held my hand. The question startled me. It had been years since anyone had asked about my guitar playing. A passion that had gradually faded as job responsibilities and family life consumed my time. Eleanor had encouraged it, even bought me a beautiful Martin acoustic for our 10th anniversary. But somehow the instrument had ended up more decoration than creative outlet. Not really, I admitted. The guitar mostly collects dust these days. You remember such specific things. I remember everything about you, Tom. Margaret's direct gaze held mine. I've had 50 years to turn those memories over like river stones, wearing them smooth with handling. Her candor caught me off guard, disrupting the careful script of casual reminiscence I'd prepared in my head. I thought about you too, I confessed. Not constantly, but at turning points, graduations, career choices. When James was born. Did you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't gone to Berkeley? She asked quietly. If I'd stayed, chosen the state college with you? Do you remember the pond at Westbrook Park? Margaret asked suddenly. Where we used to go after debate meetings? Of course, the one with the ridiculous paddle boats shaped like swans. We never actually went on those, did we? We always talked. About it, but never did. They were designed for small children, I reminded her. We would have capsized the moment we tried to board. Probably, she agreed, smiling up at me. But that's my point, Tom. There were so many things we talked about. Doing. Places we planned to go together. Lives we thought we'd build. She stopped walking, turning to face me fully. Do you ever regret any of it? The paths not taken? It was the question I'd avoided earlier, the one that felt dangerous in its honest examination of choices made and unmade. In the soft glow of riverside lights with Margaret's face upturned to mine, so different from the girl I'd loved, yet somehow essentially the same, I found I could answer truthfully. I can't regret the life I had with Eleanor or James or any of it. But yes, there have been moments when I wondered what our life might have been, Maggie. What our children might have looked like. What kind of old couple we might have become. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I wondered too, more often than I should admit. We stood in silence, the weight of 5 decades of separate joys and sorrows, achievements and disappointments suspended between us like gossamer. Then Margaret did something that shattered my careful composure. She reached up and laid her palm against my cheek, her touch feather light. We've been given such an unexpected gift, Tom. This chance to know each other again as the people we've become, rather than just the teenagers we were. My heart thundered against my ribs with an intensity that would have concerned my cardiologist. I covered her hand with mine, turning my face slightly to press my lips against her palm, a gesture of such intimacy that I surprised myself with my boldness. I'd like that, I said, my voice rougher than intended. To know you again. She smiled, withdrawing her hand slowly but maintaining our connection through her gaze. Walk me to my car? We strolled back toward the restaurant parking lot in companionable silence, her shoulder occasionally brushing mine, each point of contact sending ridiculous sparks through my system. At her modest sedan, she shrugged off my jacket, handing it back with a smile. "Thank you for dinner, Tom. And the walk. And the conversation." "Thank you for finding me," I replied simply. She hesitated, seeming to debate something internally, then made her decision. Rising on tiptoe, she pressed a kiss to my cheek, lingering just a moment longer than strictly necessary for a friendly, "Good night." "I'd like to see you again," she said. "Maybe you could show me how the town has changed. Play tour guide." "I'd like that very much." "Sunday afternoon? Around 2? "Perfect." I stood watching until her taillights disappeared around the corner, aware of a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. A lightness in my chest, a quickening of pulse that had nothing to do with my cardiac condition and everything to do with anticipation. As I drove home through familiar streets, I found myself smiling at the dashboard like a far younger man. Sunday afternoon sprawled before me, full of possibility. But first, there was the matter of my weekly video call with James and his family, a tradition instituted after Eleanor's passing that had become an anchor in my week. As I pulled into my driveway, I realized with sudden clarity that I wasn't ready to share this newly budding connection with my son or anyone else. Whatever was happening between Margaret and me felt too fragile, too precious for examination by outside eyes. Inside my empty house, the house where Eleanor and I had raised our son, entertained friends, grown old together, I hung my jacket in the closet and caught a whiff of Margaret's perfume lingering on the fabric. The scent triggered a cascade of memories. 17-year-old Maggie leaning against my locker, passing notes in Mr. Abernathy's history class, the taste of her cherry lip gloss, the feel of her hand in mine as we walked the school hallways. "Well, Ellie," I said aloud to the quiet house, using the nickname only I had been permitted to call my wife, "this is unexpected." No answer came, of course, just the familiar creaks and sighs of an aging home settling for the night. But as I moved through my evening routine, I felt an absence of the crushing loneliness that had been my constant companion since Eleanor's death. In its place was something new, or perhaps very old, resurrected from the ashes of teenage dreams I'd thought long extinguished. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Welcome back to our journey of rediscovered connection. As Thomas and Margaret's relationship deepens, the ripples of their reunion begin to spread outward, creating unexpected revelations and stirring long-buried secrets that will soon change everything. Sunday morning dawned with the particular clarity that comes after a night of restful sleep, my first in months without the pharmaceutical assistance I'd come to rely on after Eleanor's passing. I awoke feeling oddly energized, the chronically stiff knee that usually announced itself with grinding pain surprisingly cooperative as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My weekly video call with James and his family wasn't scheduled until 11:30. Leaving me with several hours to fill before I would see Margaret again. I'd channeled my nervous energy into a flurry of uncharacteristic productivity, trimming the hedge that had grown shaggy along the front walkway, finally fixing the squeaking hinge on the garden gate that had annoyed Eleanor for years before her. Illness diverted our attention from such minor irritations, even cleaning out the refrigerator with its archaeological layers of containers pushed to the back, during my widower's existence of haphazard meal preparation. By the time my laptop chimed, with James's incoming call, I'd worked up an honest sweat and changed into a fresh shirt, conscious of wanting to appear well on the camera that would transmit my image to Chicago. "Dad, you look different?" James's familiar face peered at me from the screen, his brow furrowed slightly in that way that always reminded me of Eleanor when she was puzzled. "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound casual, while wondering if my earlier resolution not to mention Margaret might be undermined by something as simple as my expression. "I don't know. Less tired? Did you start those vitamins Dr. Klein recommended?" "Just sleeping better," I deflected, relieved when my daughter-in-law Sarah appeared behind James, the twins jostling for position in front of the camera. "Grandpa, guess what? I made varsity." Zach's face filled the screen momentarily, his 15-year-old enthusiasm temporarily displacing any further scrutiny of my appearance. "That's fantastic. Starting position?" I asked, genuinely pleased and grateful for the distraction. The conversation flowed into the comfortable rhythm of family updates. Emma's debate tournament victory. I felt a pang remembering Margaret in her blue blazer at nationals, her closing argument delivered with the same passionate precision her granddaughter now displayed. Lily's science project on marine ecosystems, Sarah's promotion at the architecture firm. James mentioned their plans to visit at Thanksgiving, still 2 months away, but already requiring coordination with Sarah's parents in Seattle. "Actually, Dad, we were thinking maybe you'd like to join us in Seattle this year. The Palmer condo has plenty of room, and you haven't seen the Space Needle since that conference in '98. The invitation was unexpected, and just days earlier would have been welcome. A chance to escape the lonely holiday in a house filled with Eleanor's absence. Now, though, I found myself hesitating. That's generous of Sarah's parents, but let me think about it. There's the Hendersons' annual gathering here, and I trailed off, not ready to mention Margaret as a factor in my holiday planning. James's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sure, no rush. Just an idea." His expression turned thoughtful. "How was dinner with your high school friend? Margaret, was it?" I felt heat rise to my face, ridiculous at 73. "It was nice. Good to catch up. After all these years. Just the one dinner, then?" James pressed, his reporter's instinct for a story, inherited from Eleanor's side, clearly activated. "We're actually meeting again today," I admitted, trying to sound casual. "She's only been back in town a month, so I offered to show her around. See what's changed." Something in James's expression shifted, concern mingled with curiosity. "That's nice," he said carefully. "Good that you're getting out, making connections." The phrasing struck me as oddly clinical, as if I were a patient whose social reintegration he was monitoring. "It's just a walk around town, James. Not a therapy assignment. I didn't mean, I know you worry." I softened my tone, aware I was being overly defensive. "But I'm doing well. Better than I have been in a while, actually." Our conversation moved to safer territories, but as we said our goodbyes, James held back after the children had wandered off. "Dad, just be careful, okay?" "Careful?" I echoed, genuinely puzzled. "Walking around Clarion with an old friend hardly requires protective gear, son." "That's not—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of myself at his age that it startled me. "I just mean emotionally. It's only been 3 years since Mom died. New relationships can be complicated, especially when there's history involved." "Who said anything about a relationship?" I protested, even as I recognized the transparent nature of my denial. "We've had coffee and dinner, that's all." James's expression was gentle but knowing. "Okay, Dad. Just, I'm here if you want to talk about it. Any of it." After we disconnected, I sat staring at the blank screen, somewhat unsettled by my son's perception. Was I being reckless, allowing Margaret back into my life so soon after Eleanor? 3 years felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. The grief had transmuted from the sharp, breath-stealing pain of early loss to a persistent ache that flared unpredictably. Hearing Eleanor's favorite song in the grocery store, finding her handwriting on the back of an old photograph, the anniversary of her diagnosis. But for the first time since her passing, I'd awakened without that weight pressing against my chest. Instead, I'd felt something alien, but vaguely familiar. Anticipation. Hope, perhaps. "It's just a walk," I told my reflection, in the darkened screen. But the man looking back at me didn't appear convinced. By 1:30, I was showered, changed, and driving toward the address Margaret had texted, a modest bungalow on Maple Street that I vaguely recalled belonging to the Hendricks family when we were young. The neighborhood had gentrified considerably since then, with carefully restored craftsman homes replacing the more neglected properties of my youth. Margaret's place stood somewhere in between, freshly painted in a tasteful sage green, but with gardens that still needed attention and a front porch that tilted slightly to the left. She emerged before I could ring the bell, dressed in jeans and a light sweater in a rich burgundy that complemented her silver hair. A canvas tote bag hung from one shoulder. "Right on time," she smiled, coming down the steps to meet me. Punctuality, another quality that hasn't changed. "My father's influence," I explained, falling into step beside her as we headed toward the town center. The man believed being 5 minutes early was barely acceptable, and on time was effectively late. I remember. He wore a pocket watch, didn't he? Checked it constantly during that dinner at your house when we told your parents we were officially dating. The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. My father's stern assessment of 17-year-old Margaret, his approval finally signaled with a gruff nod and a refill of her iced tea glass. "He liked you, you know. Said you had good sense. High praise from William Ellison." "I was terrified of him," she admitted with a laugh. "But I would have endured far worse to be with you." The simple declaration hung in the air between us, weighted with decades of context. Rather than respond directly, I gestured toward the renovated courthouse ahead. They preserved most of the original facade during the renovation 10 years ago, but completely modernized the interior. The old oak tree where we used to meet after your father dropped you off for Saturday study sessions is still there, though. Margaret's eyes softened. I'd like to see it. The massive oak had, if anything, grown more impressive with age, its sprawling branches creating a natural canopy over the small park beside the courthouse. Margaret approached it slowly, laying her palm against the rough bark. "How many hours did we spend sitting under this tree?" she mused. "Planning our futures, arguing about college applications, you teaching me guitar chords, and you helping me with calculus," I added, joining her beside the trunk. "I wouldn't have passed Johnson's final without your patient tutoring." A fair exchange. I needed those guitar calluses to impress my roommates at Berkeley. She glanced up at me, her expression turning wistful. "It broke my heart to leave you, Tom. I don't think I ever told you how much." The directness of her statement caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. Margaret had always possessed a forthright quality that eschewed social pretense, a trait that had both attracted and occasionally flustered my more reserved teenage self. "You wrote it, though," I said quietly. "In that last letter from Vermont, before you headed to California. I kept it for years, tucked in my chemistry textbook." She looked genuinely surprised. "You did?" I thought. "After I made my decision about Berkeley, when your letters became less frequent, I assumed you'd moved on, started dating Eleanor." "Not right away," I admitted. "That was later, after I'd accepted you weren't coming back for winter break as we'd planned." Margaret's eyes clouded. "My father's heart attack changed everything. I couldn't leave my mother alone to manage his recovery, the medical bills. Staying in California for those extra credits made financial sense." I understood that, I assured her. "But at 19, understanding logically and accepting emotionally are different creatures entirely." She nodded, a melancholy smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Our timing was never quite right, was it? And now here we are, half a century later, two entirely different people standing in the same spot where it all began." "Not entirely different," I said softly, reaching for her hand before I could second-guess the gesture. Her fingers interlaced, with mine naturally, as if the intervening decades had never passed. Some things remain constant. We stood like that for a long moment, connected by more than just our clasped hands, by shared memories, by the particular understanding that comes from having known someone at their most formative stage. Then Margaret squeezed my fingers gently before releasing them. "Show me more," she requested. "Show me how our town has changed." Over the next 2 hours, we wandered through the transformed landscape of our youth. The old movie theater now converted to a performing arts center, the soda shop replaced by an artisanal coffee roaster, the community pool where we'd spent countless summer days, now a sleek aquatic facility with lap lanes and water slides. Throughout our tour, Margaret asked insightful questions about the town's evolution, occasionally linking arms with me to cross busy intersections or leaning close to hear my explanations over street noise. Each casual touch sent a ridiculous thrill through my system, awakening nerve endings I'd thought permanently dormant. I found myself manufacturing reasons to maintain physical contact, pointing out architectural details that required her to stand close beside me, steering her around sidewalk obstacles with a hand at the small of her back, helping her up stone. Steps that she was perfectly capable of navigating alone. If Margaret noticed my transparent tactics, she gave no indication, instead seeming to welcome these small intimacies. By the time we reached Riverside Park, the final stop on our impromptu tour, the initial awkwardness had dissolved completely, replaced by a comfortable rapport that felt both brand new and as familiar as breathing. "I brought something," Margaret said as we settled onto a bench overlooking the river. She reached into her tote bag and withdrew a small photo album bound in faded blue fabric. "Michelle found this when she was helping me unpack. I thought you might like to see it." She passed the album to me, and I opened it carefully, unprepared for the emotional impact of what lay inside. There I was, impossibly young with dark hair falling across my forehead, arms slung around Margaret's shoulders as we posed beside my father's Oldsmobile. Another shot showed us at winter formal, Margaret radiant in a simple blue dress that matched her corsage, me looking simultaneously terrified and proud in my rented tuxedo. "Good Lord," I murmured, turning pages slowly. "Look at us. We were children." "With very adult feelings," Margaret observed, leaning against my shoulder to see the photos. "At least they felt adult at the time." "They were real, though," I said, pausing at a candid shot of us sitting under the courthouse oak, my guitar across my lap, Margaret's head thrown back in laughter. Maybe naive, maybe limited by our experience, but genuine nonetheless. "Yes," she agreed softly. "They were." I continued turning pages, each image triggering cascading memories. The senior picnic where I'd first told her I loved her, debate tournaments where we'd competed as partners, her father's fishing cabin where we'd spent a chaperoned but still magical weekend with her family the summer before graduation. The final page held a pressed corsage, the once vibrant blue flowers now fragile and colorless. "You kept this? All these years?" I asked, genuinely moved. Margaret nodded, her shoulder still warm against mine. "Through 3 states, 2 children, 1 marriage, and more addresses than I care to count. Richard found it once, shortly after we were married. He wasn't pleased." "I can imagine," I said, thinking of how I might have reacted had I discovered a similar keepsake of Eleanor's previous relationship. "He asked if I wanted to leave him, go find you." Margaret's voice had grown quieter. "I told him no, of course. I loved him, truly loved him, Tom. But I never could bring myself to discard these memories either." She closed the album gently, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. "They were part of what shaped me, part of my history. Throwing them away would have been like tearing pages from my own story." The sentiment struck me deeply. I had kept no such tangible mementos of Margaret. My mother's practicality and Eleanor's presence in my life had ensured that, but I understood precisely what she meant. Our brief but intense relationship had influenced choices I'd made, perspectives I'd developed, even my approach to teaching years later. "I understand," I said simply. Margaret tilted her face up to mine. studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken despite my age and cardiovascular history. Do you ever wonder, Tom, if there are parallel universes? Other versions of ourselves who made different choices? The philosophical question was unexpected, but quintessentially Margaret. Even as teenagers, she'd been prone to these conceptual explorations while I remained more firmly anchored in practical realities. Sometimes, I admitted, though I've always been more inclined to focus on the path before me rather than the ones not taken. The scientist versus the dreamer, she smiled. Some dynamics never change. We balanced each other that way, I observed. We did. Her agreement carried weight beyond the simple words. After a moment, she straightened, tucking the album back into her tote. I should be getting back soon. Michelle and Stephanie are bringing the twins for dinner. Of course. I tried to hide my disappointment that our afternoon was ending. As we walked back toward her bungalow, Margaret slipped her hand into mine with a naturalness that belied the significance of the gesture. Would you like to join us for dinner? The invitation caught me by surprise. Meeting her family represented a definitive step beyond nostalgic reconnection into something more concrete, more present-focused. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to intrude on family time. You wouldn't be intruding, she assured me. Michelle knows we've been spending time together. She's curious about you. Curious or concerned? I asked, only half joking. Margaret's laugh held a note of rueful acknowledgement. Perhaps a bit of both. She's protective, especially after losing her father. But she wants me to be happy, Tom. And I contribute to that? Your happiness? The question emerged more vulnerable than I'd intended. She stopped walking, turning, to face me fully on the sidewalk. Yes, she said simply. You do. These past few days have been illuminating. I'd forgotten what it feels like to be truly seen by someone, to share a history that doesn't require constant explanation or context. The sincerity in her eyes undid my hesitation. Then I'd be honored to join you for dinner. Her smile bloomed, warming me more effectively than the autumn sunshine. Wonderful. Fair warning, though, the twins are exhausting. In the best possible way. I raised a teenage boy, I reminded her. I think I can handle 10-year-olds for one dinner. 2 hours later, I found myself at Margaret's dining table, watching in fascination as Eliza, one half of the precocious twin set, systematically deconstructed the relationship between Margaret and myself with the precision of a miniature psychological examiner. So you knew Grandma Maggie when she was a kid? Eliza asked, her dark eyes, so like Margaret's, studying me over a forkful of lasagna. Not exactly a kid, I clarified. We were in high school together. And you were boyfriend-girlfriend? Her twin brother Aiden contributed, less interested in my answer than in building a mashed potato dam around his portion of green beans. For a while, yes. Margaret answered for me, her composure admirable in the face of cross-examination by elementary schoolers. And then what happened? Eliza pressed, clearly the more relationship-focused of the pair. Margaret and I exchanged glances across the table. We went to different colleges, I explained, opting for the simplest version of events. Your grandmother went to California and I stayed here. But you still liked each other? Eliza continued, undeterred. We did, Margaret confirmed. But sometimes life takes people in different directions, even when they care about each other. Like, when Dad moved to Minneapolis for that job but came back because he missed Mom too much? Aiden contributed unexpectedly, revealing depths of family history I hadn't anticipated. Something like that, Michelle interjected, casting an apologetic glance my way. At 40-something, she was a striking combination of Margaret and what I assumed were her father's features. Tall and angular where Margaret was more petite, but with the same expressive eyes and direct gaze. Maybe we could give Mr. Ellison a break from the interrogation, guys, Tom, please, I insisted, having already made this request several times. Michelle's smile was polite but reserved, her assessment of me ongoing throughout the meal. Her wife, Stephanie, a pediatrician with a warm manner and quick laugh, had been more immediately welcoming, drawing me into conversations about their recent trip to the Galapagos and the challenges of raising scientifically minded twins in the age of social media. "So, Tom," Michelle said as Margaret and Stephanie cleared dinner plates, "Mom mentioned you were a teacher?" 40 years at Ridgeview High, I confirmed. History and government, primarily, though I taught some English courses in my early years. Before specializing. That explains it, she nodded, as if confirming a theory. Explains what? Your patience with the twins' questioning. Most people would have shut down after the third degree about your teenage romance with their grandmother. I laughed. Occupational hazard of working with adolescents for decades. I developed immunity to uncomfortable questions long ago. I'm sure. She studied me over her wine glass. You should know. My mother hasn't shown interest in anyone since my father died. This, whatever it is between you, represents a significant development. The directness of her statement, so reminiscent of Margaret, demanded equal forthrightness. In response, I understand. If it helps, I haven't shown interest in anyone since my wife passed either. This is unexpected territory for both of us. Mom seems happy, Michelle acknowledged. More animated than I've seen her in years, actually. But she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She's been through a lot. The last few years with Dad were difficult. His heart condition required constant monitoring, adjustments, worries. She put everything aside to care for him, her art, her social connections, her own needs. I just want to make sure she isn't rushing into something as a reaction to all that sacrifice. I felt a surge of respect for this woman's protective instinct, even as I recognized the implicit warning in her words. I have no intention of hurting your mother, Michelle. We're reconnecting, seeing where this might lead. That's all. And if it leads somewhere significant, she pressed. Before I could formulate a response, Margaret returned, her quick glance between us suggesting she'd caught the serious tenor of our conversation. Everything okay here? Just getting to know each other, Michelle said smoothly, rising to help with dessert. Later, as I prepared to leave, the twins finally succumbing to their mother's increasingly firm reminders about bedtime routines and school tomorrow, Margaret walked me to my car, the evening air carrying the first real hint of autumn chill. They like you, she said, wrapping her cardigan more tightly around herself. Especially Eliza. She's already making plans for you to judge her science fair project next month. I'd be honored, I said, genuinely touched by the child's immediate inclusion of me in her future plans. They're remarkable kids. You must be proud. Immensely. Though Michelle gave me a few gray hairs before settling into her current sensible phase. She smiled up at me, the porch light illuminating the fine lines around her eyes that I was beginning to find increasingly beautiful. Thank you for coming tonight, for braving the family gauntlet. It was my pleasure, truly. I hesitated, aware we had reached another threshold in this evolving relationship. The dinner had shifted something, moved us from reminiscing about past connection to creating new bonds in the present. Margaret seemed to sense my thoughts. This is real, isn't it? What's happening between us? Yes, I said simply. I believe it is? She nodded, a decision visibly forming in her expression. Then, with the same directness that had characterized her at 17, she stepped forward, rising on tiptoe to press her lips gently against mine. The contact was brief but electric, sending a current of sensation through my body that seemed to reawaken nerve endings long dormant. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. Joy, certainly, but also something more complex. Wondering, perhaps, or recognition. "Good night, Tom," she said softly. "Call me tomorrow?" "Absolutely," I promised, resisting the powerful urge to pull her back into my arms, conscious of the house full of family behind her. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Clarion, I realized I was smiling so broadly that my cheeks actually ached from the unaccustomed exercise. The kiss replayed in my mind, innocent by teenage standards but profound in its adult context, a deliberate choice to move beyond friendship into something more intimate. My phone buzzed as I pulled into my driveway, a text from James. "How was your day with Margaret?" I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How much should I share? How soon? The protective instinct to keep this precious, fragile connection private warred with the desire to share my unexpected happiness with my son. "It was wonderful." I typed finally. "We had a good day. I'll tell you more soon." Inside my house, the house that had felt so empty for 3 years, I moved through my evening routine with uncharacteristic energy. As I passed the hallway bookshelf, my gaze fell on a framed photo of Eleanor, taken on our 30th anniversary trip to London. Her smile was radiant, her eyes crinkled with happiness as she posed beside a red telephone booth. "I think you'd approve, Ellie," I said softly to her image. "You always did say I was hopeless at being alone." No response came, of course, but as I continued down the hallway, I felt a curious lightness, as if some portion of the grief I'd carried had finally begun to lift, making room for something new to grow in its place. As Thomas and Margaret's renewed relationship blossoms, the foundations beneath their carefully constructed lives begin to shift. What starts as a simple reconnection continues to ripple outward, stirring questions and revelations that neither of them could have anticipated. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret and I fell into a rhythm that felt both entirely new and comfortingly familiar. Coffee dates blended into leisurely walks, shared meals, and quiet evenings on her slowly straightening porch, where we'd installed rocking chairs reminiscent of those on my parents' veranda half a century earlier. Each day brought fresh discoveries about the people we had become during our decades apart, along with reassuring confirmations of the essential qualities that had drawn us together as teenagers. Margaret's curiosity remained insatiable. She devoured books on every subject, maintained strong opinions on politics, and asked penetrating questions that reminded me why she had been such a formidable debate partner in our youth. Her laugh still carried that distinctive musical quality that turned heads in restaurants. Her hands still gestured expressively when she was passionate about a topic. Yet there were differences too, layers of experience that had shaped her into someone more nuanced, more patient, more comfortable with life's inherent contradictions than the idealistic girl I'd known. She spoke with hard-earned wisdom about her years as a working mother, the challenges of her marriage during Richard's frequent relocations, the recalibration required when her career as a librarian had been repeatedly interrupted by his corporate assignments. "I don't regret the choices," she told me one evening as we shared a bottle of wine on her porch, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. "But I do wonder sometimes about the roads not taken. My mentor at Berkeley wanted me to pursue a PhD in literature. I was accepted to the program at Columbia." "I didn't know that," I said, genuinely surprised. The Margaret I remembered had been passionate about education, but had spoken more about teaching than academic research. "I never told anyone except my parents," she admitted. Richard had just proposed. His first job offer was in Houston, and it seemed impossible to pursue both marriage and a doctorate 3,000 miles apart. She swirled the wine in her glass thoughtfully. Different era, different expectations. Young women were still making those kinds of sacrifices without much question. "Would you choose differently now?" I asked, curious rather than judgmental. Her gaze turned inward, considering. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I loved Richard. Our life together, despite its complications, gave me Michelle and David, experiences I wouldn't trade for any academic achievement. But I would have approached it with more awareness, perhaps negotiated better terms, insisted on finishing my master's degree sooner, instead of putting it off for 10 years. I nodded, understanding completely. My own career had been more linear, but not without its compromises. Eleanor wanted to go back to teaching after James started school, I shared. Her mother's Parkinson's diagnosis changed everything. Caregiving consumed so much of her energy that adding professional responsibilities seemed impossible. Did she resent it? Margaret asked softly. Not resent, exactly. More like a quiet mourning for a path foreclosed. I smiled, remembering Eleanor's characteristic resilience. She channeled her teaching instincts into volunteer work once her mother moved to assisted living. Literacy programs at the community center, ESL classes for immigrants. She was remarkably adaptable. It sounds like, "You had a good partnership," Margaret observed, no jealousy in her tone, merely appreciation. We did. Not perfect, we had our rough patches, especially when James was a teenager and simultaneously pushing boundaries while dealing with his grandmother's declining health. But we were a team. I was fortunate. Margaret reached across the space between our rockers and squeezed my hand briefly. She was fortunate too, Tom. These conversations formed the foundation of our deepening connection. Honest exchanges about lives lived fully, if imperfectly, shared without the need to impress or conceal. There was something profoundly liberating about this late-life relationship, freed from the pressures of building careers or raising children, unburdened by the need to impress in-laws or establish social standing. We were, at last, simply ourselves. Our physical relationship progressed with a gradual tenderness that surprised me after the urgency that had characterized our teenage romance. That first kiss on her porch led to others, in my kitchen as we prepared dinner together, beside the riverbank, during a particularly glorious sunset, in her car after a movie at the restored theater downtown. Each felt simultaneously familiar and brand new, a rediscovery of something once known intimately, but transformed by time and experience. We moved slowly, neither of us feeling rushed to define what was developing between us or to push toward greater physical intimacy. My doctor might have claimed this restraint was the natural consequence of age and medication, but I knew better. What slowed us was not physical limitation, but emotional respect, for ourselves, for each other, and for the significant relationships we had each lost. "I'm not ready," Margaret confessed one evening, after a particularly intense moment on my couch had naturally eased back into conversation rather than progression toward the bedroom. Not because I don't want to, but because it feels like crossing. A threshold I can't uncross. "I understand completely," I assured her, stroking her silver hair where it fell across my shoulder. "There's no rush, Maggie. We have time." The irony of that statement, two septuagenarians claiming the luxury of time, made us both laugh, diffusing any awkwardness that might have lingered. What we didn't discuss, at least not explicitly, was how our rekindled relationship was being perceived by our respective families. Margaret mentioned occasional probing questions from Michelle, whose initial wariness had softened marginally as she observed her mother's evident happiness. I fielded increasingly curious texts from James, who seemed torn between genuine pleasure at my improved spirits and concern about the implications of my involvement with the one who got away. "Dad, I just want to make sure you're thinking clearly about this," he said during our weekly call, after I'd mentioned taking Margaret to the symphony in the neighboring city. "Long-distance relationships are complicated, and Mom's only been gone 3 years. It's hardly long distance when she lives 10 minutes away," I pointed out, trying not to sound defensive. "And I'm aware of the timeline, James. I was there." His sigh carried clearly through the phone. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but you've mentioned this Margaret person in every conversation for the past month. It seems like it's getting serious." "Pretty quickly." "Quickly?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Son, We've known each other for over 50 years. If anything, we're moving at a glacial pace. You know what I mean, he persisted. You've been on your own since Mom died. I just want to make sure you're not filling a void without thinking about the long-term implications. His concern, though well-intentioned, irked me more than I cared to admit. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a teenager, James. I'm quite capable of managing my own relationships. Of course you are, he backpedaled. We all just want you to be happy, Dad. After we disconnected, I sat for a long while in my study, contemplating the family dynamics at play. James had been 14 when my mother died, 26 when we lost his maternal grandmother to Parkinson's, and 42 when cancer took Eleanor. Each loss had shaped him, particularly his mother's death, which had coincided with his own marital difficulties, temporarily resolved but still tender in family memory. His protective instinct toward me, his concern that I might be making decisions out of loneliness rather than clear judgment, came from a place of love. Yet it chafed against my need for autonomy, my desire to pursue happiness without justifying my choices to my adult son. I was still pondering this tension the following Saturday when Margaret invited me to join her at the farmer's market. October had painted the town in brilliant crimsons and golds, and the market bustled with vendors selling the last of summer produce alongside pumpkins, gourds, and fresh-pressed apple cider. Tom, is that really you? A familiar voice cut through the market chatter as Margaret and I examined heirloom tomatoes at the Peterson farm stand. I turned to find Carol Henderson advancing toward us, elegant as always in a tailored wool coat, her carefully maintained blonde hair gleaming in the autumn sunshine. Beside her, her brother Robert, a history professor at the community college and occasional golf partner, raised a hand in greeting. Carol, Robert, I nodded, suddenly conscious of Margaret's hand resting lightly on my arm. How are you both? Well, Carol answered, her curious gaze shifting between Margaret and myself with barely concealed interest. It's been ages since I've seen you at the market. George always claimed you avoided it because of the crowds. George Henderson, Carol's late husband and my occasional fishing companion, had indeed teased me about my dislike of the weekend market crush. His absence still created a momentary pang, though less sharp than it once had been. I've been persuaded to brave the masses, I said, gesturing toward Margaret. Carol, Robert, this is Margaret Collins. An old friend recently returned to Clarion. Margaret, Carol Henderson, and her brother Robert Mitchell. Collins, Robert repeated, brow furrowing. In concentration, not Maggie Collins from Westlake? Debate team, class of 73? Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. That's right. Though I don't think You wouldn't remember me, Robert laughed. I was 2 years behind you, a sophomore when you were a senior. But everyone knew Margaret Collins. You demolished Hammond Prep at the state finals with that closing argument about environmental regulation. A faint blush colored Margaret's cheeks. That was a lifetime ago. And now you're back in Clarion, Carol observed, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with assessment. Visiting? I've moved back, actually, Margaret clarified. My daughter and her family live here. How lovely, Carol smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. And you and Tom reconnected? Recently. The question hung in the air, its real meaning transparent to all of us. Carol and Eleanor had been close, not best friends, but regular lunch companions and co-chairs of various community committees over the years. Her protective interest was both expected and slightly uncomfortable. Facebook, Margaret supplied smoothly. The modern equivalent of a high school reunion, but with better lighting and no name tags. Robert laughed genuinely at this, while Carol's smile turned a fraction warmer. Well, it's wonderful to see Tom getting out and about. We've all been concerned since Eleanor passed. The well-intentioned comment sparked a flicker of irritation. Getting out and about. as if I were an invalid taking his first tentative steps after a lengthy convalescence. Before I could respond, Margaret's hand tightened slightly on my arm. "Tom has been kind enough to reacquaint me with Clarion," she said, her tone pleasant but with a subtle edge I recognized from our debate days. "It's changed considerably since I left, but some things remain wonderfully constant, like the community's close-knit nature." Carol nodded, seemingly oblivious to the gentle pushback in Margaret's words. "Indeed. Well, we shouldn't keep you from your shopping. Tom, don't forget the Historical Society meeting next Thursday. We're finalizing plans for the Veterans Memorial fundraiser." "Wouldn't miss it," I assured her, though in truth the meeting had slipped my mind entirely. As Carol and Robert continued through the market, Margaret turned to me with a raised eyebrow. "Historical Society?" "One of Eleanor's projects that I inherited," I explained. "Carol's particularly invested because her father and George both served in Vietnam. And she's particularly invested in you as well, I noticed," Margaret observed without rancor. "How long have they been trying to set you up with each other?" The perception startled me. "Carol and me? Good Lord, no. George was one of my closest friends. Besides, she's involved with someone from her church group, at least according to town gossip." Margaret looked skeptical. "If you say so. But that was definitely a territorial assessment I just received." "Surely not," I protested. Though a subtle uneasiness suggested she might be right. Carol's increased attention since Eleanor's passing, the casseroles that continued long after the official mourning period, the regular invitations to Henderson family gatherings, her insistence that I maintain involvement in Eleanor's various committees, took on a different cast when viewed through Margaret's perspective. "Trust me," Margaret smiled, selecting a particularly perfect tomato and adding it to our basket. I recognized the look of a woman wondering who this interloper is and what exactly she's doing with her designated widower. The phrasing made me laugh despite my discomfort. Her designated widower? That makes me sound like community property. "In small towns, eligible men your age practically are," Margaret teased, steering us toward a bakery stand. "Especially ones with their own homes, all their original teeth, and no significant criminal history." "You make me sound like a prize show pony," I grumbled good-naturedly. "More like a rare vintage," she corrected, her eyes warm with affection. "Improved with age and best appreciated by a connoisseur." The compliment, delivered with characteristic Margaret directness, warmed me more effectively than the autumn sunshine. As we continued through the market, I found myself especially aware of familiar faces registering our presence together. The subtle double takes, the curious glances, the occasional knowing smile. Clarion might have grown considerably since our youth, but it retained the essential character of a small town where significant developments rarely went unremarked. By the time we reached Margaret's bungalow with our market bounty, I'd mentally catalogued at least a dozen encounters that would inevitably fuel the town's gossip mill. The realization didn't particularly trouble me. At 73, I'd long since outgrown concern about becoming the subject of coffee shop speculation. But it did prompt practical considerations. "People will talk," I observed as we unpacked. "Vegetables in her kitchen. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret glanced up from arranging apples in a bowl, her expression thoughtful. "Does it bother you?" "Not for myself," I said honestly. "But I wouldn't want it to create discomfort for you, especially as you're reestablishing yourself here." Her laugh held genuine amusement. "Tom, I spent 25 years in small towns across the country as the wife of a corporate executive. Trust me, I'm well acquainted with being the subject of community interest." She placed the last apple in the bowl and turned to face me fully. "The real question is whether it bothers you to be seen moving on from Eleanor so publicly." The question cut to the heart of something I'd been avoiding examining too closely. Not guilt, exactly, but a certain awareness that my happiness with Margaret might be perceived as diminishing what Eleanor and I had shared. The rational part of me knew this was nonsense. Eleanor herself would have been the first to dismiss such zero-sum thinking about relationships. Yet the irrational part, the part shaped by social expectations and the peculiar grief culture that canonized deceased spouses, whispered doubts I couldn't entirely silence. I want to say it doesn't matter what anyone thinks, I began slowly, choosing my words with care. But that would be dishonest. I do think about how James might feel seeing town gossip about his father's new relationship. I think about Eleanor's friends who might view this as somehow disloyal to her memory. I moved closer to Margaret, taking her hands in mine. But what I think about most is that I'm happier with you in my life than I've been in years. And I'm too old to pretend otherwise for the sake of anyone's comfort, including my own. Something softened in her expression, a tension I hadn't fully registered until it released. That's a very good answer, Professor Ellison. I had an excellent debate partner who taught me to address the strongest counter-arguments first. I smiled, drawing her into my arms. This kiss was different from our previous exchanges, deeper, more certain, carrying an intent that had been carefully restrained until now. Margaret responded with equal certainty, her body fitting against mine with a rightness that defied our years apart. "Stay for dinner," she murmured when we finally parted. "I'll make that tomato tart you liked from Julia Child's cookbook." "I'd love to," I agreed, reluctant to release her. "And after dinner," she continued, her eyes holding mine steadily, "perhaps you might consider staying longer." The invitation, delivered with characteristic Margaret directness, left no room for misinterpretation. My pulse, which my cardiologist monitored with diligent concern, accelerated in a manner that would have registered concern on his many instruments. "Are you certain?" I asked, remembering her earlier hesitation about crossing thresholds that couldn't be uncrossed. "I am," she nodded. "Life's too short for unnecessary caution, especially at our age. And I've wanted this, wanted you, since that first dinner at Riverside." Her honesty, as always, inspired my own. "I've thought of little else," I admitted. "But I worried about rushing you, about dishonoring what you had with Richard or I had with Eleanor." "Tom," she said softly, framing my face between her hands, "loving someone new doesn't diminish what we shared with them. Richard and Eleanor were fundamental parts of our lives, parents to our children, companions through decades. Nothing changes. That." She smiled, a hint of her youthful mischief surfacing. "But they're gone, and we're still very much here. I think they'd both want us to remember that." "Eleanor would definitely want me to remember that," I agreed, thinking of my practical wife's frequent admonitions against excessive sentiment. She made me promise not to become a hermit after she was gone. "Smart woman," Margaret nodded approvingly. "She was," I confirmed, feeling the familiar pang of loss, but now accompanied by something new. A sense of continuity rather than ending, of life's persistence through grief rather than its cessation. The afternoon unfolded with a pleasant domesticity. Margaret preparing pastry dough while I chopped vegetables, companionable conversation flowing between us as naturally as it had. When we were 17, we opened a bottle of good Cabernet, Margaret telling stories of her son David's adventures in Seattle's tech industry, while I shared James's latest parenting challenges with his teenage daughters. As twilight descended, turning the kitchen windows into mirrors that reflected our movements, I was struck by the extraordinary ordinariness of it all. Two people sharing food preparation, wine, conversation. The simplest of human connections, yet containing within it the profound comfort that comes from being truly seen and accepted. Dinner itself was delicious. The tomato tart every bit as good as I remembered from Eleanor's attempts at French cooking during our early marriage. But it was the company rather than the cuisine that made the evening significant. Margaret's animated discussion of the book she was currently reading, her genuine interest in my perspective on the town's development plans, the easy flow of conversation unmarked by the awkward pauses or careful subject avoidance that often characterized interactions with newer acquaintances. As we cleared the table together afterwards, the awareness of her invitation hung between us, not awkwardly, but with a pleasant anticipatory tension that reminded me of those long-ago evenings in my parents' Oldsmobile, when each moment carried the delicious question of how far our explorations might progress. "I should warn you," Margaret said as she loaded the dishwasher, a hint of vulnerability in her voice, "that 70-year-old bodies don't quite match our memories from high school." I moved behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist and pressing, a kiss to the sensitive spot below her ear that I'd rediscovered during our recent embraces. "Thank goodness for that. I much prefer the real woman to the memory." She turned in my arms, her expression a mixture of desire and lingering uncertainty. "Even with the wrinkles and the less-than-perfect parts?" "Especially with those," I assured, her realizing I meant it completely. Margaret's body, like my own, carried the evidence of life fully lived. The slight softening around the middle, the laugh lines etched permanently around her eyes, the silvered hair that caught the kitchen, light. These weren't imperfections but authenticities, physical manifestations of experiences that had shaped us into the people now finding their way back to each other. "Then, I believe," she said, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against mine, "that we have a threshold to cross, Professor Ellison." Later, much later, as we lay in the quiet darkness of Margaret's bedroom, her head resting on my shoulder and her breathing deep and regular in sleep, I found myself experiencing a profound sense of homecoming. Not the feverish excitement of new passion, though there had been plenty of genuine passion despite our septuagenarian status, but something deeper, the recognition of a connection that transcended time, circumstance, and the separate lives we had built during our decades apart. Carefully, so as not to disturb her rest, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, intending to set an alarm. The screen illuminated with notifications, 2 missed calls from James, followed by a text message that made my blood run cold. "Dad, call me ASAP." Something weird happened today. David Wilson from Seattle contacted me through LinkedIn. Says his mother is Margaret Wilson, Collins, and she's been staying with his sister Michelle in Clarion. He found my profile while looking up your name. Says he has some questions about our family history that can't wait. What the hell is going on? In the dim light from my phone screen, I studied Margaret's peaceful face, the features I'd relearned. Over these past weeks now completely familiar once more. The implication of James's message, the strange urgency of David Wilson's contact, stirred uncomfortable questions I had never thought to ask. What connected our families beyond our teenage romance? What possible family history could link us in ways requiring urgent discussion after 50 years? And why would Margaret's son, a stranger on the opposite coast, be researching my name? Online? As I carefully replaced my phone on the nightstand, Margaret stirred slightly, murmuring something indistinct before settling back into sleep. Whatever questions needed answering would wait until morning. For now, I pushed aside the disquiet and allowed myself to simply be present in this unexpected chapter of my life, even as I sensed the narrative was about to take a turn I couldn't possibly have anticipated. As the morning light reveals new complications, Thomas and Margaret find themselves confronting questions that reach back through 5 decades of separate lives. The past, it seems, has never been fully settled, and revelations are about to change everything they thought they knew. I woke to unfamiliar surroundings, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous evening reassembled themselves in my consciousness. Margaret's bedroom was bathed in early morning light filtering through lace curtains I suspected had belonged to the previous owners, as they didn't match Margaret's more contemporary taste. She wasn't beside me, but the sound of a kettle whistling from the kitchen and the aroma of coffee suggested she hadn't gone far. Reaching for my phone, I checked the time, 7:14 a.m., and saw another message from James. "Dad, please call when you—" Get this. Important. The urgency in his tone, coupled with the cryptic message about Margaret's son from the night before, sent a ripple of unease through my morning contentment. What possible connection could there be between our families that would prompt David Wilson to seek out my son through professional social media? I dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, running a hand through my disheveled hair in a futile attempt at presentability. In the kitchen, Margaret stood at the stove in a blue robe, her silver hair tousled in a way that struck me as both vulnerable and endearing. She turned as I entered, her smile warming me more effectively than the coffee she was pouring. "Good morning," she said, crossing to hand me a steaming mug. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," I admitted, accepting both the coffee and the quick kiss she offered. "Though I feel like a teenager who's missed curfew, wearing yesterday's rumpled clothes." She laughed, the sound still musical even with the slight morning raspiness in her voice. "I rather like the rumpled look on you." "Very distinguished professor who's been up all night with important research." I smiled at her teasing, but couldn't fully suppress the nagging concern about James's messages. Margaret, perceptive as always, picked up on my distraction immediately. "Is something wrong, Tom?" I hesitated, uncertain how to broach the strange communication without creating unnecessary alarm. "I'm not sure. James texted last night and again this morning. Apparently your son David contacted him through LinkedIn. Something about family history questions?" Margaret's coffee mug halted halfway to her lips, her expression shifting from contentment to confusion. "David contacted James? That's odd. How would he even know about your son?" "Apparently he found him while searching my name online. James said he mentioned you were staying with Michelle here in Clarion." She set her mug down carefully, a vertical line appearing between her brows as she frowned. "I told David about reconnecting with you, of course. We spoke last week on the phone, and I mentioned I'd found my high school sweetheart on Facebook. But I don't understand why he would reach out to James without talking to me first." The question hung between us, accompanied by a subtle shift in the morning's atmosphere, from the warm intimacy of new lovers to something more cautious, tinged with uncertainty. "I should call James back," I said finally. "Find out what exactly David wanted." Margaret nodded, her expression troubled. "Of course. I'll give you some privacy. I need to shower anyway." She paused at the kitchen doorway, turning back with an attempted smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Right?" "Absolutely," I assured her, though the tiny seed of unease had begun to germinate in earnest. Once alone in her kitchen, I dialed James's number, bracing myself for whatever complication might be about to enter our lives. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting with phone in hand. "Dad, finally, where have you been?" The relief in his voice quickly gave way to suspicion. "Wait, it's 7:30 in the morning. Are you at our house?" "James," I said firmly, "I'm a 73-year-old widower, not a teenager answering to a curfew. Yes, I'm at Margaret's. Now what's this about her son contacting you?" He made a sound that might have been embarrassment or disapproval, perhaps both, before continuing. "Right. So, this guy David Wilson messages me on LinkedIn yesterday afternoon, very polite, professional, says he noticed I'm Thomas Ellison's son and his mother is Margaret Collins, who recently reconnected with you in Clarion. Asks if I'd be willing to talk with him about family matters of mutual interest that are somewhat sensitive in nature. That's all? He didn't specify what these family matters might be?" "No, that's just it. Very vague, but weirdly urgent. Said he's flying into Clarion next weekend and would appreciate meeting in person if possible. I checked him out online. He seems legitimate. Environmental engineer with a major firm in Seattle. Married, one college-age daughter. James paused. Dad, what's going on? Do you have any idea what this could be about? Honestly, no, I admitted, glancing toward the hallway where I could hear the shower running. Margaret seems just as puzzled. She knew I had a son named James, but we haven't discussed our families in great detail. James's skepticism traveled clearly through the phone line. So you've been seeing this woman for a month. She's your long-lost high school girlfriend who apparently kept a scrapbook of your teenage romance for 50 years, and you haven't talked about your families? That seems unlikely. His characterization stung with its implication that I was either lying or being deliberately oblivious. We've discussed our spouses, our careers, our general life paths. But no, we haven't conducted genealogical research on each other's extended families. It hasn't seemed relevant to our reconnection. Well, something about your histories seems extremely relevant to her son, James countered. Relevant enough for him to track me down professionally and fly across the country. I'll talk to Margaret, I promised. See if she has any insights, once she's had time to think about it. In the meantime, did you agree to meet with David? I said I'd need to consult with you first, James replied. He's given me his number to call back. Should I agree? I considered my options carefully. Refusing to meet would only heighten the mystery and potentially create unnecessary tension. Yes, go ahead and set something up. I'd like to understand what this is about, and Margaret will want to see her son while he's in town anyway. You're not concerned about whatever this sensitive family matter might be? The water had stopped running in the bathroom, indicating Margaret would rejoin me soon. Curious, yes. Concerned. I don't see any reason to be alarmed by a son wanting to visit his mother and possibly meet her new friend. James made a non-committal sound. If you say so, I'll let you know when I've arranged something with him. Thank you. I hesitated, then added, I'm sorry if this has created any worry for you, son. I'm sure it's nothing significant. After we disconnected, I stood staring out Margaret's kitchen window at her small backyard garden, still lush with late-season vegetables despite October's advancement. The mundane normality of ripening tomatoes and overgrown zucchini provided a stark contrast to the unsettled feeling taking root inside me. What possible family matter could connect the Ellisons and the Wilsons beyond Margaret's and my teenage relationship? And why would it require David's urgent attention after 50 years of separate lives? Margaret reappeared, dressed in slacks and a casual sweater, her damp hair combed back from her face. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable without her usual careful styling and light makeup. What did James say? She asked, moving to refill, her coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. I related the conversation as accurately as possible, watching her expression cloud further with each detail. By the time I mentioned David's planned visit the following weekend, she had sunk into one of the kitchen chairs, coffee forgotten on the counter. This makes no sense, she said, more to herself than to me. David's never shown any interest in family history before. His focus has always been firmly on the future. Renewable energy, sustainable architecture, leaving a better world for his daughter. She looked up, her eyes troubled. And why approach James rather than simply calling me directly? That's what I've been wondering, I admitted, joining her at the table. The only connection between our families is our brief relationship in high school. Unless... I hesitated, reluctant to voice what now seemed an obvious possibility. Unless what? Unless there's something about that time you haven't told me? I suggested gently. Something that might have long-term implications for our children. Margaret's eyes widened. And then, to my surprise, she laughed, though the sound held more incredulity than humor. You think, Tom, surely you're not suggesting that David might be your son. Is that what this is about? The directness of her question momentarily flustered me. The thought had occurred. Given the timing and urgency, her expression softened from shock to understanding. Oh, Tom. No. David was born in 1981, 8 years after we parted ways. Richard was absolutely his father. She reached across the table to take my hand. I would never have kept something like that from you. Never. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by embarrassment at having considered the soap opera-worthy scenario, however briefly. I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me. It was a logical question, given the circumstances, she assured me. But no, whatever this is about, it's not a decades-old paternity revelation. Then I'm at a loss, I admitted. What would David need to discuss with James that he couldn't simply ask you? Margaret withdrew her hand, her gaze turning inward. I don't know, but I intend to find out. She stood, moving with sudden purpose toward where her phone lay charging. I'm calling David right now. Whatever this is about, I want it addressed directly, not through cryptic messages to your son. I watched as she dialed, her posture straightening, into what I recognized as her debate stance. Shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, prepared to address a challenging opponent. After several rings, her expression shifted to disappointment. Voicemail, she explained, before speaking clearly into the phone. David, it's Mom. I understand you've contacted Thomas Ellison's son about some family matter. I'd appreciate it if you'd call me immediately to explain what this is about. I'm with Tom now, and we're both rather confused by your approach. She paused. I love you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next weekend, but please call me back today. She set the phone down with more force than necessary, her frustration evident. This isn't like David. He's usually so straightforward, especially with me. Would Michelle know what's going on? I suggested, grasping for any possible clarification. Margaret considered this, then shook her head. Possibly. But David and Michelle aren't particularly close. The age gap, 6 years, and the geographical distance have made their relationship more cordial than intimate. But I suppose it's worth asking. She typed rapidly on her phone, sending what I presumed was a text to her daughter. The morning that had begun with such peaceful intimacy had transformed into something tense and unsettled, the shadow of an unknown complication falling across the kitchen. I'm sorry about this, Margaret said suddenly, setting her phone down and returning to where I sat. Whatever it is, it's clearly coming from my side of things, and it's casting a pall over what should be a happy time for us. The vulnerability in her voice, so at odds with her usual confidence, moved me deeply. I rose and pulled her into my arms, feeling her relax against me with a small sigh. Don't apologize, I said softly, against her hair, which smelled of lavender shampoo. Family complications are part of life at our age. We've both accumulated decades of connections, decisions, and yes, occasionally drama. It doesn't change anything between us. She tilted her face up to mine, her eyes searching my expression. Doesn't it? You were ready to believe you might have a secret son a moment ago. Momentary insanity, I assured her with a rueful smile. Too many late-night movies, perhaps. And now? How do you feel now? I considered the question seriously, wanting to give her my most honest answer. Curious, certainly. A bit concerned about why this requires such urgency and secrecy. But most of all, I feel committed to facing whatever this is together with you. One cryptic message isn't going to undo what we've been building these past weeks. Her smile, tremulous but genuine, rewarded my sincerity. I'm holding you to that, Professor Ellison. The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo of attempted normalcy, undercut by the persistent awareness of David's unexplained communique. We made breakfast together, took a walk through the neighborhood as planned, even spent a pleasant hour helping Margaret rearrange furniture in her living room to better accommodate the new reading chair she'd ordered. Throughout it all, though, Margaret checked her phone regularly for responses from either David or Michelle, her disappointment evident each time she found none. By mid-afternoon, her patience had clearly frayed. "This is ridiculous," she declared, setting her gardening gloves aside where we'd been mulching her flower beds for winter. "I'm calling Michelle directly. Text messages aren't cutting it," I continued, spreading mulch as Margaret paced the small backyard, phone pressed to her ear. Her side of the conversation was frustratingly opaque. "Yes, I'm still with Tom." "No, that's not—" "Michelle, please just tell me if you know why your brother is contacting Tom's son. Of course it concerns me." "What do you mean you don't think it's your place? Since when do you and David have—" "Secrets from me? Fine. Yes, next weekend. Yes, I understand." She disconnected with visible irritation, shoving the phone into her pocket before rejoining me at the flower bed. "No joy?" I asked, though the answer was evident. "Michelle knows something," Margaret confirmed, attacking a pile of mulch with unnecessary vigor. She admitted David had called her last night, but claimed it wasn't her place to explain his reasons for contacting James. She suggested I wait until David arrives next Saturday to discuss it in person. "That's nearly a week away," I observed. "Exactly. And I'm expected to just sit with this mystery until then?" She straightened, brushing dirt from her knees with sharp, agitated movements. "This isn't like my children, Tom. We've always been direct with each other, sometimes to a fault. This secretive behavior is completely out of character." I set my rake aside and moved to her, placing my hands gently on her shoulders. "Then perhaps there's a good reason for it. Something they feel needs to be discussed in person rather than over the phone." Her eyes met mine, troubled and uncertain. "That's what worries me. What could be so significant that it requires face-to-face conversation? And why involve your son rather than simply talking to me directly?" I had no answer for her, only reassurance that we would face whatever came together. But as the afternoon progressed into evening, a subtle distance had crept between us. Not emotional coldness, but rather the natural caution that emerges when certainty is replaced by question marks. When I finally prepared to leave her house that evening, returning to my own place seemed prudent given our unsettled state. Margaret walked me to my car, with a pensive expression. "I hate that this has cast a shadow," she said, leaning against the car door. "Yesterday was everything I'd hoped it would be, Tom. I don't want whatever this is to tarnish that." "It won't," I promised, cupping her face gently between my hands. "Some administrative family matter won't change what's developing between us, Maggie. I hope." "You're right." She reached up to cover my hands with her own. "Call me tomorrow?" "Absolutely." I kissed her goodbye, trying to infuse the gesture with all the certainty I wanted to feel. Driving home through quiet Sunday evening streets, I found my mind racing with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. What could possibly connect? Our families beyond our teenage romance? Was there some business dealing between Richard Wilson and the Ellisons I'd forgotten? Some distant shared relative we'd never discussed? By the time I pulled into my driveway, physical and emotional fatigue had overtaken speculation. My house, empty and slightly musty from my overnight absence, seemed particularly lonely after the warmth of Margaret's presence. I moved through the familiar rooms, picking up mail, adjusting the thermostat, performing the mundane tasks of homecoming without fully engaging with them. In my study, I noticed the light blinking on my answering machine, an antiquated device I maintained primarily for James's children to leave messages when they couldn't reach me by cell phone. Expecting perhaps a follow-up from my earlier conversation with James, I pressed play. "Mr. Ellison, this is David Wilson, Margaret Collins's son." The voice was pleasant, articulate, with the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully. "I understand you and my mother have reconnected recently, and I apologize for the unorthodox approach of contacting your son rather than speaking with you directly. I believe that once we've had a chance to meet in person, my reasons will become clear. I'll be arriving in Clarion next Saturday morning. Perhaps we could arrange a time to speak privately before I see my mother. I can be reached at this number. The message ended with his contact information, which I dutifully copied into my phone, staring at the digits as if they might provide insight into the enigmatic communication. A private conversation before he saw Margaret? The request only deepened the mystery while amplifying my unease. Should I tell Margaret about this direct contact? The question troubled me as I prepared for bed. On one hand, transparency seemed the only ethical approach to our newly intimate relationship. On the other, David had specifically requested privacy, and perhaps there were legitimate reasons for his caution. I decided to sleep on the decision, but rest proved elusive. My mind replayed every conversation Margaret and I had shared about our respective families, searching for clues I might have missed. Nothing suggested any connection beyond our own brief relationship decades earlier. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would call David back and agree to meet him, but I would also tell Margaret about the contact. Our relationship was too important, too precious in its second-chance rarity, to risk undermining it with secrets. I called her early, before my courage could falter. "David left me a voice message last night," I said after our initial greetings. "He wants to meet privately before seeing you on Saturday." Her sharp intake of breath carried clearly through the phone. "And will you?" "Yes," I admitted. "I think we need to understand what this is about, but I wanted you to know, no secrets between us, Maggie. Whatever this turns out to be, we'll navigate it together." Her relief was palpable even through the distance. "Thank you for telling me, Tom. This whole situation has me on edge in ways I can't fully explain. It feels significant somehow." "We'll face it as it comes," I assured her, hoping my voice conveyed more certainty than I felt. One day at a time. The week that followed passed with excruciating slowness, each day marked by a peculiar combination of deepening connection between Margaret and me. We spent every evening together, talking, cooking, gradually learning the rhythms of each other's daily lives, and mounting anticipation of David's arrival. James called midweek to confirm he had arranged to meet David for lunch on Saturday, his tone suggesting he remained skeptical about the entire situation. "Are you sure you want to be involved in whatever this is, Dad? It's not too late to step back." "I'm sure," I told him firmly. "Margaret is important to me, James. If there's some family matter that connects us, I want to understand it fully." By Friday evening, as Margaret and I shared a quiet dinner at my house, the strain of waiting had made us both unusually subdued. Even our goodbye kiss at her car held a tentative quality, as if we both sensed that whatever tomorrow brought might fundamentally alter the relationship we were still carefully constructing. "No matter what," I said, holding her close before she left. "Remember that what we've found these past weeks is real. Whatever history might emerge tomorrow doesn't change that present reality." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but she nodded. "I'm holding on to that thought, Tom. Tightly." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that would normally have lifted my spirits. Instead, I found myself obsessively checking the clock as I waited for David's call. We'd arranged via text that he would contact me after his lunch with James, a meeting scheduled for noon. At 1:47 p.m., my phone finally rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Ellison, David Wilson. I've just finished meeting with your son." "Please call me Tom," I offered automatically. "How was your conversation with James?" A pause stretched between us. "Illuminating," he said finally. "For both of us, I think. Would it be possible to meet this afternoon? Perhaps at your home, for privacy." "Of course. I'm at 247 Oakwood Drive. What time works for you?" "I can be there in 30 minutes if that's convenient." After we disconnected, I moved through my house with nervous energy, straightening magazines, adjusting chair positions, behaviors Eleanor would have recognized as my pre-parent-teacher conference ritual. Whatever information David Wilson carried felt momentous in ways I couldn't articulate, and some primitive part of me apparently believed a tidy living room might somehow mitigate its impact. At precisely 2:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find a tall man with Margaret's eyes and jawline standing on my porch. He wore a business casual outfit that suggested his professional background, and his expression was simultaneously kind and apprehensive. "Tom." "Ellison?" I extended my hand. "You must be David." "I am," he confirmed, his handshake firm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me like this. I know the approach has been unorthodox." "Please come in." I gestured toward the living room, where I'd prepared coffee and water options on the side table. "I have to admit, you've created quite a mystery these past few days. Both your mother and I are extremely curious what possible family matter could connect us beyond our brief high school relationship." David settled onto my sofa, declining offered refreshments with a slight shake of his head. "Yes, I imagine this has caused some confusion. I apologize for that, but after speaking with my sister and considering all angles, I felt this approach was best." He hesitated, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Before I continue, I want to be clear that I have no intention of disrupting the relationship you're developing with my mother. Michelle says she's happier than she's been since my father died, and that matters a great deal to me." "I appreciate that," I said cautiously, sensing we were circling the central issue. "Margaret is very important to me as well." David nodded, his fingers intertwining in a gesture of tension I recognized from Margaret's debate preparations decades earlier. "The thing is, Mr. Ellison, Tom, I've recently been doing some family research. My daughter Sophia is taking a genetic anthropology course at university, and as part of a class project, we all submitted DNA samples to one of those ancestry services." He met my gaze directly. The results were unexpected. A cold feeling began spreading through my chest. "In what way?" "According to the genetic analysis, my father, Richard Wilson, was not my biological father." The statement hung in the air between us, its implications expanding to fill every corner of the room. I found myself momentarily unable to respond, my mind racing to calculate timelines, possibilities. "I was born in 1981, David continued into my silence. 8 years after you and my mother dated in high school. There's no possibility of direct connection there." He paused, watching my reaction carefully. "But the Ancestry Service linked me to several genetic relatives, including a second cousin named Anna Ellison Campbell." The name registered immediately. My cousin William's daughter, named after our grandmother. "Anna is my first cousin once removed," I confirmed, still not seeing the full picture. "Yes. And through that connection and subsequent research, I was able to establish that my biological father was not Richard Wilson, but rather," he took a deep breath, "Robert Ellison, your younger brother." As shock gives way to understanding, Thomas and Margaret must confront a past more entangled than either could have imagined. Long-buried secrets rise to the surface, threatening to redefine not just their rekindled relationship, but the very foundations of their family histories. For several moments, I simply stared at David, his words echoing in my head without fully registering. Robert, my younger brother by 4 years, the mathematics prodigy who'd left Clarion for MIT at 18 and rarely returned except for obligatory holiday visits. Was this man's biological father? The concept seemed so utterly implausible that my mind struggled to process it. That's not possible," I finally managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Robert barely knew your mother. They met perhaps once or twice when we were teenagers." David nodded, his expression sympathetic but resolute. "I understand this is shocking. Believe me, I've been processing it myself for weeks. But the genetic evidence is conclusive. I'm approximately 25% genetically related to your son James, consistent with being his first cousin once removed." "The DNA doesn't lie, Tom." I rose from my chair, needing physical movement to accompany the whirlwind of my thoughts. Robert and Margaret? When? How? My brother had been a shy, awkward 14-year-old when Margaret and I dated, more interested in mathematical theorems than girls, perpetually buried in textbooks while I navigated the social intricacies of high school. The few times he'd been around Margaret, he'd barely spoken, his adolescent discomfort with pretty older girls painfully evident. "Have you spoken to Robert about this?" I asked, turning back to face David. A shadow crossed his features. I tried. I found his contact information through the university where he teaches. I sent an email explaining the situation and requested a conversation. He never responded. That, at least, sounded like my brother. Avoidance had always been his preferred. Approach to emotional complications. After our mother's funeral, he'd departed before the reception concluded, citing a research deadline. When his own marriage dissolved after just 3 years, he'd simply announced it in a terse email to the family, declining all offers of support or discussion. "And your mother, Margaret, she doesn't know any of this yet?" I confirmed, trying to organize my chaotic thoughts. "No. Michelle knows. She was my sounding board through the initial discovery. But we agreed that before approaching Mom with something this potentially devastating, I needed more information." David leaned forward, his earnestness reminiscent of Margaret in her most passionate moments. "That's why I contacted James first. I needed to understand your family dynamics, to gauge how this revelation might affect all parties involved. I didn't want to hurt my mother, or you, without fully comprehending the context." I sank back into my chair, still struggling to reconcile this information with everything I knew, or thought I knew, about Margaret and my brother. "David, I don't mean to be indelicate, but are you absolutely certain about this? These ancestry tests have been known to have errors, or to be misinterpreted." "I had the same question," he acknowledged. "After the initial results, I consulted with a genetic counselor who specializes in unexpected parentage discoveries. She confirmed the analysis and helped me understand the implications. I then had a more comprehensive test done specifically to confirm these findings." His expression was gentle but firm. "There's no mistake, Tom. Robert Ellison is my biological father." The certainty in his voice left no room for denial. I found myself mentally calculating months and years, trying to construct a timeline where this revelation made sense. Margaret and I had dated throughout our senior year of high school, from September 1972 until graduation in June 1973. She'd left for her grandparents' house in Vermont immediately afterward, then directly to Berkeley. In August, I'd remained in Clarion, attending state college while caring for my mother, whose rheumatoid arthritis had begun its crippling progression. "When were you born exactly?" I asked David. "February 14th, 1981. I counted backward quickly. "So conceived around May 1980? He nodded, watching me closely. "Mother and Richard married in December 1979, shortly after they met at a university function in Berkeley. I was born 14 months later." The timing made the situation even more baffling. By 1980, Margaret had been at Berkeley for 7 years, while Robert was finishing his doctorate at MIT on the opposite coast. How could their paths possibly have crossed during that period? "I know what you're thinking," David said quietly. "The geography doesn't make sense. Mom was in California, and from what James told me, your brother was in Massachusetts. But they must have connected somehow, somewhere." "Robert did a summer research program at Berkeley," I recalled suddenly, memory surfacing from decades past. 1979 or 1980, I think. Something related to his dissertation. He mentioned it during a rare phone call home. David's expression intensified. That would align perfectly with the timeline. If they reconnected during that summer program. "But your mother was married by then," I pointed out, still struggling to reconcile the Margaret I knew, principled, direct, honest, with this scenario. Newly married, David agreed, to a man she'd known for a relatively brief time. Perhaps there were complications in the early marriage, or unresolved feelings from the past. The implication hung between us that Margaret's relationship with my brother might have been influenced by her former relationship with me. The thought created a complex tangle of emotions I wasn't prepared to unravel in front of her son. "This is a lot to process," I said finally, understating the situation dramatically. David nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I understand. And I realize this revelation potentially complicates your relationship with my mother. That wasn't my intention, but I felt you deserved to know before I approached her." "Does James know all of this now?" I asked, suddenly remembering my son's involvement. "Yes. We met for lunch today and I explained everything. He was surprised, to say the least, but he handled it with remarkable composure." David's lips curved in a slight smile. He said, and I quote, "Well, this certainly explains Dad's attachment to your mother. The Ellison men apparently have a genetic predisposition toward Collins women." Despite the gravity of the situation, I found myself appreciating my son's characteristic dry humor. The observation, while glib, contained a kernel of unexpected truth. There was indeed something about Margaret Collins that had captivated not just one, but apparently two Ellison brothers. "What happens now?" I asked, the practical question cutting through my emotional turmoil. David's expression turned serious again. "I need to tell my mother. Today, preferably. She deserves to know the truth about my paternity, and she should hear it from me, not through speculation or secondhand information." He hesitated. "I'd like you to be there, if you're willing. Not for the initial conversation. That should be private between us. But afterward, I think she'll need support from someone who understands the full complexity of the situation." The request surprised me. "You barely know me, David. Why would you want me involved in something so deeply personal?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because you care about her. Because this revelation affects you too. And because, however unexpected the connection, we're actually family." He smiled slightly. "You're my uncle, technically speaking. That means something, even in these bizarre circumstances." The simple biological fact hadn't fully registered until he stated it so plainly. This man, Margaret's son, an environmental engineer from Seattle with her expressive eyes and thoughtful demeanor, was my nephew. Not by marriage or social convention, but by blood. "Yes," I agreed finally. "I'll be there for Margaret, if she wants me there." Relief washed across David's features. "Thank you. I've arranged to meet her at Michelle's house at 5 o'clock. Perhaps you could come by around 6. That should give us time for the initial conversation." After confirming the address, though I'd already been to Michelle's home for dinner, David prepared to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back with an expression of genuine concern. "I truly hope this doesn't destroy what you and my mother have been building, Tom. Michelle says she hasn't seen her this happy in years." "I hope so too," I replied honestly, though uncertainty clouded my vision of the future. How would Margaret react to this revelation? Would she be angry, defensive, devastated? And perhaps more selfishly, how would this change her feelings about reconnecting with me? Was our rekindled relationship somehow tainted by this unexpected connection to my brother? After David left, I moved through my house in a daze, mechanically, performing household tasks while my mind raced with implications and questions. By 5 o'clock, my anxiety had reached a fever pitch. I imagined Margaret's shock, her potential shame or embarrassment, the emotional turmoil she must be experiencing at this very moment, as her son revealed a truth she had apparently kept buried for over 40 years. Had she known all along? The questions surfaced unavoidably, bringing with it a cascade of others. Had Margaret been aware that Robert, not Richard, was David's father? Had she deliberately concealed this fact throughout her marriage, throughout her son's life? And if so, what did that reveal about the woman I thought I knew so well? I realized with sudden clarity that I was angry, not just confused or hurt, but genuinely angry at the possibility that Margaret had maintained such a significant secret while building an intimate relationship with me. Our conversations about our past had felt so open, so honest. How could she have omitted something so fundamental? But even as indignation flared, rational thought tempered it. Perhaps she hadn't known. DNA testing of this sophistication wasn't available until relatively recently. If her relationship with Robert had been brief, if it had overlapped with the early days of her marriage to Richard, confusion about paternity would be understandable. And once David was born, once she was established in her marriage, what reason would she have had to question her son's parentage? By 5:45, I could wait no longer. I drove to Michelle's house, arriving 15 minutes earlier than planned. The modest two-story home looked unchanged from my previous visit, though the twins' bicycles were absent from the front yard. Likely they were staying elsewhere this evening, a wise precaution given the emotional conversation taking place inside. Sat in my car, debating whether to wait the full 15 minutes or approach the house early. The decision was made for me when the front door opened and David emerged, his face grave as he spotted my vehicle. He walked over immediately, leaning down to my open window. "I'm glad you're here early," he said, his voice tight with strain. "It's not going well. Mom is extremely upset." Alarm surged through me. "What happened?" She denied it at first, categorically, completely. Said it was impossible, that the testing must be wrong. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Margaret's that it momentarily disoriented me. When I showed her the genetic counselor's report, explained the conclusiveness of the evidence, she just shut down. She's refusing to discuss how it could have happened. Michelle's with her now, but she's asking for you. The news that Margaret wanted to see me despite, or perhaps because of, this emotional crisis sent a complicated wave of relief through my system. "Of course, I'll go right in." "Thank you," David said, his relief evident. "I'll wait out here for a while. She needs some space from me right now." Inside the house, I found Michelle pacing the living room, her expression taut with concern. She gave me a quick nod of acknowledgement as I entered. "She's in the guest room," she said without preamble. "Down the hall, second door on the left. She's been asking for you for the past 20 minutes. "How is she?" I asked, already moving in the direction indicated. Michelle's expression was grim, distraught. I've never seen her like this, not even when Dad died. She keeps saying none of it makes sense, that there must be some mistake. She hesitated, then added more quietly, "I don't think there is a mistake, though. David's been extremely thorough with the testing. This is real, Tom." "I understand," I assured her, though in truth, I understood nothing about this situation with any certainty. The guest room door was partially ajar. I knocked gently before pushing it open further. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her back rigid, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had whitened. She looked up as I entered, and the raw vulnerability in her expression nearly undid me. "Tom," she said, her voice hoarse, as if she'd been crying or shouting or both. "You know." It wasn't a question, but I nodded confirmation anyway. "David came to see me earlier today." Her laugh held no humor, just a bitter edge I'd never heard from her before. "And what do you think of this absurd claim? That somehow, without my knowledge or consent or even memory, I conceived a child with your brother, a man I barely knew?" I moved cautiously into the room, settling onto a chair opposite her. "I think the genetic evidence seems conclusive, Maggie. But I also think there must be an explanation that makes sense of this." "An explanation?" Her voice rose slightly. The only possible explanation is that these tests are wrong. I never had a relationship with Robert Ellison. Never. The vehemence of her denial gave me pause. She seemed genuinely bewildered, not defensive, or evasive as I might have expected if she were hiding something. Robert was at Berkeley in the summer of 1980, I said gently, for a research program. Do you remember encountering him then? Her brow furrowed, concentration momentarily displacing distress. 1980. I was working at the university library that summer. Richard had just started his position at the firm. In San Francisco. We were saving for a house. She trailed off, her expression distant. Berkeley hosted dozens of summer programs every year. I wouldn't necessarily have known about all of them. But is it possible you ran into Robert? Perhaps recognized him as my brother? Margaret's eyes clouded with uncertainty. I don't. Tom, I honestly don't remember seeing Robert that summer, or any summer after I left Clarion. She pressed her fingers to her temples, as if physically trying to access buried memories. The only time I recall meeting your brother was at your house, a few times when we were in high school. He was younger, quiet, always with a book. That sounds like Robert, I agreed, trying to maintain a gentle, non-accusatory tone despite my own churning emotions. But according to the genetic testing, he is David's biological father. So there must have been some contact between you in 1980. Margaret's composure cracked suddenly, her eyes filling with tears. Do you think I'm lying? That I've hidden some secret affair all these years? That I would build this relationship with you while concealing something so significant? No, I said quickly, moving to sit beside her on the bed and taking her trembling hands in mine. No, I don't think you're lying, Maggie. I think you genuinely don't remember, which suggests there's more to this story than any of us understands yet. She leaned against me, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. David looks at me differently now, like he doesn't know who I am. Like, I've deliberately kept his true parentage from him his entire life. Her voice broke. I would never do that, Tom. Never. I know, I soothed. Though in truth, I was still grappling with the implications myself. David's in shock, too. He's trying to make sense of this just like you are. We sat in silence for several minutes, her head against my shoulder, my arm around her waist. The intimacy we'd cultivated over the past month had been fundamentally altered by this revelation, yet the instinct to comfort her, to stand beside her through this crisis, remained undiminished. What do I do now? She asked. Finally, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from the confident woman I'd known. How do I explain something I don't understand myself? We start by talking to Robert, I said firmly, the path forward suddenly clear. If David can't get a response, perhaps I can. He may have answers that make sense of this situation. Margaret straightened, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. And if he doesn't respond to you either? Robert always was the most elusive of your family, even when we were young. Then we keep looking for answers elsewhere, I assured her. University records, mutual acquaintances from that summer. There must be something that will jog your memory, some explanation that reconciles the genetic evidence with your experience. A knock at the door interrupted us. Michelle appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic. Sorry to intrude, but David's wondering if he could join you. He's struggling too, Mom. Margaret drew a deep breath, visibly gathering her composure. Of course, send him in. David entered cautiously, his tall frame somehow diminished by the emotional weight of the situation. He remained near the doorway, hands in his pockets, uncertainty evident in his stance. I'm sorry, he said simply. I never meant to cause this much pain. I thought we deserved the truth. Margaret extended a hand toward her son, her expression softening. I know. And we do deserve the truth. All of us. I'm not angry with you, David. I'm just bewildered. And hurt that you might think I deliberately kept this from you. I don't think that, he assured her quickly, moving to take her offered hand. At least, not anymore. Your reaction makes it pretty clear you're as shocked as I was. The three of us sat in an awkward triangle. Margaret between David and me, physical links established through held hands, but emotional connections strained by the weight of unanswered questions. I think we need to approach this methodically, I suggested, falling back on the organized problem-solving that had served me well through decades of teaching. First step, I'll contact Robert directly. As his brother, I might get a response, where David couldn't. And if he continues to avoid the subject? Margaret asked. Then we look at other sources, David interjected, professional problem-solving instincts apparently aligning with mine. University archives might have records of that summer program, participant lists, perhaps even photographs. Mom, do you have any journals or letters from that period? Anything that might reference encounters you've forgotten? Margaret considered this. I kept journals sporadically throughout my 20s. Most of my papers are in storage in Phoenix, but I might have preserved some from that era. Her brow furrowed in concentration. And there are photos, of course. Albums from my Berkeley years that Michelle helped me unpack. That's a start, I encouraged. Between university records and personal archives, we might find something that helps reconstruct that summer. As we discussed next steps, I observed Margaret's expression gradually shifting from devastated shock to determined problem-solving. The transformation reminding me powerfully of the debate team captain who had never accepted defeat without exhausting every possible argument. This, her resilience, her unwillingness to collapse under even the most disorienting revelations, was one of the qualities that had drawn me to her both as a teenager and now, 5 decades later. There's another consideration, David said after a moment, his expression cautious. My daughter Sophia. Your granddaughter, he nodded toward Margaret, and apparently your grandniece, he added to me with a hint of the surreal humor this situation demanded. She's the one who initiated this discovery with her anthropology project. She's aware of the genetic findings, though not of all the emotional complications. She'll need to be informed of what we learn. Margaret nodded, her hand tightening on her son's. Of course, she deserves to know her heritage. Complicated as it apparently is. And James? David asked, turning to me. He knows the biological connection now, but how much of this aftermath should I share with him? The question gave me pause. James was already concerned about my relationship with Margaret. How would this bizarre complication affect his perspective? Would it reinforce his caution about our reconnection? Or would he see, as I was beginning to, that this shared crisis was actually strengthening the bond between us? I'll talk to him, I decided. He should hear this from me, not secondhand. As our conversation continued, Michelle joined us, bringing much-needed coffee and creating a strange family council, 3 generations linked by both choice and newly discovered blood, trying to make sense of a past that had suddenly been rewritten. By the time we dispersed several hours later, David to his hotel, Michelle to retrieve the twins from their friend's house, Margaret and I to her bungalow where neither of us wanted to be alone, we had assembled a concrete plan of action. I would contact Robert directly the following day. David would follow up with Berkeley's archives department about summer program records. Margaret would search her photo albums and journals for any clues. Michelle, with her librarian's research skills, would check newspaper archives for any events that summer that might have included both Robert and Margaret. In Margaret's living room that night, a fire crackling in the hearth against the autumn. Chill, we sat in companionable silence, both mentally exhausted from the day's emotional marathon. She had changed into comfortable clothes, soft pants and an oversized sweater that made her look simultaneously vulnerable and resilient. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "For not doubting me, for not assuming the worst. I reached for her hand, twining our fingers together. I know you, Maggie. Both the girl you were and the woman you've become. Whatever happened that summer, whatever we discover, I trust your integrity. She turned to me, her eyes still reddened from earlier tears, but now clear with purpose. We will figure this out, won't we? Together? Absolutely, I promised. Though I admit, when I imagined complications in our rekindled relationship, I was thinking more along the lines of disagreements about which restaurants to frequent or whose house has the more comfortable couch. Her laugh, genuine despite the lingering tension, warmed me more effectively than the fire. The universe apparently had more dramatic plans for us. The universe, or my apparently secretive younger brother, I corrected dryly. Margaret's expression turned thoughtful. What was Robert like? After high school, I mean. Did he change much from that quiet boy always buried in mathematics textbooks? Sigh. Question made me realize how rarely I spoke about my brother, how peripheral he had remained to my life despite our shared upbringing. He became more focused, if that's possible. Brilliant in his field, theoretical mathematics with applications I barely understand. Socially, though, he remained awkward, isolated. His marriage was brief and, from the little he shared, unsuccessful. No children. I paused, the irony suddenly striking me. Or so we all believed. Do you think he knows? Margaret asked quietly. About David, I mean. Do you think that's why he's avoiding contact? The question had been circling in my mind throughout the day. It's possible. If he recognized your name when David reached out, he might have connected the dots. I frowned, troubled by the implication. But that would mean he's knowingly avoided his own son for 40 years, which seems extreme even for Robert's avoidance tendencies. Unless there were circumstances that made such avoidance seem necessary, Margaret suggested. Something about that summer that neither of us is remembering correctly. The observation hung between us, pregnant with possibilities too complex to unravel in our current state of emotional exhaustion. Whatever had happened in Berkeley during the summer of 1980, whatever connection had formed between Margaret Collins and Robert Ellison, remained shrouded in a fog that neither genetic testing nor our combined memories had yet penetrated. Tomorrow, I said, squeezing her hand gently. We'll start finding answers tomorrow. Margaret nodded, leaning her head against my shoulder in a gesture that felt simultaneously new and centuries old. Together, she agreed softly. Whatever we discover, we face it together. As the fire burned lower, casting the room in a gentle, amber glow, I found myself contemplating the strange twist our rekindled romance had taken. What had begun as a simple reconnection between former sweethearts had transformed into something far more complex. A mystery spanning decades, a biological connection neither of us had anticipated, a shared journey into a past that apparently held secrets neither of us fully understood. Yet despite the shock and confusion of the day, I realized with quiet certainty that my feelings for Margaret remained unchanged, or perhaps had even deepened through this crisis. Seeing her vulnerability, her determination to understand, her unwavering commitment to truth despite its potential cost, had only confirmed what I'd been discovering over these past weeks, that the woman she had become was even more remarkable than the girl I had once loved. Whatever tomorrow's investigation revealed, whatever explanation emerged for David's unexpected paternity, I knew with absolute certainty that I would be standing beside her when the truth finally came to light. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more heartbreaking than any scenario we had imagined. Robert answered my third phone call after a week of persistent attempts. His voice, so rarely heard over the decades, sounded resigned, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 40 years. I wondered when. This day would come, he said without preamble. I assume it's about David Wilson. The confirmation stunned me into momentary silence before I managed to ask the question that had consumed us all. What happened that summer in Berkeley, Robert? His sigh carried the weight of decades. A faculty mixer. She didn't recognize me. At first, I'd changed since high school. When she realized I was your brother, we talked about you, about how she'd regretted leaving. She'd just married Richard, but it was clear she was uncertain. We had too much wine. It was one night, Tom. Just one. She didn't know my name when she left. She called me Bobby all evening, and I never corrected her. She thought I was Robert Mitchell. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Robert Mitchell, Carol Henderson's brother, who'd recognized Margaret at the farmer's market, the man who'd been 2 years behind us in school, who'd known Margaret from debate team. The missing piece clicked into place with devastating clarity. When I told Margaret, her eyes filled with tears of recognition, then relief. That's why I never connected them. In my mind, they were entirely different people. Oh, Tom. The conversation with Robert continued over lengthy emails. His apology. To both Margaret and David, his explanation of discovering the truth years later through a chance encounter with Richard at an academic conference, his decision to remain silent rather than disrupt their family. David struggled with the revelation but ultimately extended forgiveness to Robert for his silence, and more importantly, to Margaret for an innocent mistake that had shaped his existence. Michelle helped broker peace, her practical nature grounding the swirling emotions surrounding us all. As for Margaret and me, we weathered this storm together, emerging with a connection deeper than our teenage romance could ever have achieved. The complexity of our entwined families created occasional awkwardness, but also unexpected richness. Sophia, technically my grandniece, but more practically just a delightful young woman, visited for Thanksgiving, bringing laughter and academic curiosity to our table. James and his family joined us, his initial reservations about my relationship with Margaret dissolving in the face of our evident happiness. Last week, on a crystal-clear autumn morning almost identical to the day I'd first received Margaret's Facebook message, I asked her to marry me. At 73 and 70, we'd both outlived conventional timelines, but we agreed that life was too precious to waste on arbitrary waiting periods. I thought I'd been given a second chance at happiness when you messaged me, I told her as we stood beneath the courthouse oak tree where we'd sat as teenagers. I had no idea how much more complex and how much richer that second chance would become. Margaret's eyes, still that remarkable shade between green and amber, crinkled with the smile I'd fallen in love with twice in one lifetime. Some stories don't end with goodbye, she said, echoing words I'd thought to myself months earlier. They're just waiting for the next chapter to begin. The end.